The champagne glass was still cold in my hand when I heard my son call me a burden. Not to my face, never to my face, that would have required courage. He said it to his new father-in-law, laughing. His voice pitched just low enough to feel private and just loud enough for me to catch every word over the string quartet. Honestly, I only invited him because I had to. He's always been kind of a burden. I stood there in my rented tuxedo, in a building I owned, at a wedding I was quietly paying for, in more ways than anyone in that room understood, and I smiled. I raised my glass to my son and his bride, and I said nothing at all. My name is Harold Reyes. I'm 61 years old, and I have spent most of my adult life being underestimated, which turned out to be the single most useful skill I ever developed. I didn't set out to build it that way. It just happened, the way most true things happen, slowly and without anyone noticing until it was already done. The Wilmont estate sits on 11 acres outside of town, the kind of place with a stone fountain out front and oak trees old enough to have shaded 3 generations of brides. Ashley, my son's new wife, had shown me photos of it back in the spring, practically vibrating with excitement. "Dad, wait till you see this place. It's the most beautiful venue in the county. We got so lucky with the booking." I'd nodded and told her it looked lovely. I did not tell her that luck had nothing to do with it, that the booking calendar had cleared because the owner of Crestline Holdings, the holding company that quietly bought the estate 6 years ago and spent 18 months restoring the ballroom's original hardwood floors, happened to know exactly which weekend his son's wedding would need. I did not tell her because Derek had never asked how I spent my days. He assumed, the way people assume about a man who wears the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation and drives a truck with 210,000 miles on it, that I did some quiet, unremarkable thing with my time. Handyman work, maybe, a little property management. He was not wrong, exactly. He was just wrong about the scale. I stood near the back of the reception hall that night with my glass sweating in my hand, watching 200 guests move through a room I had personally chosen the paint color for. Sage and cream, the color Marion would have picked. My wife had been gone 6 years by then, and I still made decisions the way I imagined she'd approve of. Even the small ones, even the ones nobody would ever know were mine to make. Roy Calloway, Ashley's father, stood a few feet away in a gray suit that fit him the way expensive things fit men who are used to having them. He ran Calloway Construction and Design, a mid-size outfit that had expanded hard about 4 years back. New equipment, a second crew, a loan that I happened to know the exact size of because I had quietly purchased it from the original bank 2 years ago as a routine investment. Not for leverage, not for control. Just numbers on a spreadsheet that made sense at the time. I had never met Roy Calloway before that week. I had extended his payment terms twice without either of us ever speaking directly, a courtesy passed through account managers, the kind of grace a lender gives when the underlying business looks sound and the family, unbeknownst to him, happens to be marrying into mine. Derek was laughing at something Roy said. He had his tie loosened, his collar open, that easy confidence he'd worn since he was a boy who never once had to ask twice for anything. And then he said it. A burden. He said it the way you'd mention the weather, offhand, already moving on to the next sentence before the word had finished landing. I did not confront him. I want to be honest about that, because everything that came after depends on you understanding this was not rage. Rage is loud. What I felt was quieter and colder than that, something that settled into my chest like a stone dropping into still water, rings moving outward long after the stone itself had disappeared from view. I excused myself to the men's room. I stood at the sink and looked at a man in a rented tuxedo who owned the floor he was standing on, and I took out my phone. My lawyer, a good friend named Marcus, had sent over a draft that morning, a wedding surprise. The two of us had discussed it for weeks. Papers that would have quietly gifted Derek a stake in Crestline Holdings' venue division. Papers that would have forgiven the last balloon payment on Roy Calloway's loan outright. A gift disguised as luck. The kind of thing a father does without ever needing thanks for it. I read through the draft one more time under the fluorescent bathroom light. Then I closed it, and I opened a different document instead. One that did the opposite of everything Marcus and I had planned. I put my phone back in my pocket, straightened my jacket, and walked back out to the reception. I found my seat. I raised my glass one more time when the toasts came around, and I smiled at my son the way I had smiled at him his entire life. Nobody in that room had any idea what I had just decided to sign. I want to go back further than the wedding, because none of what I did that night makes sense without understanding how a man like me ends up quietly owning the floor his son is dancing on. Marion got sick 8 years ago. Ovarian cancer. Stage 3 by the time they found it, which is the cruelest kind of number because it sits right at the edge of hope without ever quite handing you enough of it. We spent everything trying to buy her more time. Savings, the equity in our house, a second mortgage I never told the kids about because Marion said something to me one night in the hospital that I've never forgotten. Let them have a normal-looking dad, Harold. Let them worry about normal things. So I did. I kept the worry to myself the way I kept everything to myself. And when she passed 2 years later, I was left with a modest house, a truck with too many miles on it, and a hole in my chest the size of everything we'd never get to do. Grief does strange things to a man's habits. Mine turned me into someone who couldn't sit still. I started small. A foreclosed duplex 2 towns over, bought for almost nothing, fixed up with my own 2 hands on weekends because working with my hands was the only thing that quieted my mind enough to sleep at night. Then a strip of retail units. Then, 6 years ago, a run-down estate property outside of town with a ballroom floor buried under 3 layers of ugly carpet and a fountain that hadn't run water since the Reagan administration. I named the holding company Crestline, after a ridge Marion and I used to hike before she got sick. Nobody in my family ever heard that name. I kept Crestline separate from Reyes the way you'd keep 2 different lives in 2 different rooms of the same house. And I told myself that was just prudent business practice. The truth, if I'm honest with you the way I've tried to be honest through every part of this, is that it was also something else. It was mine. The one thing in 11 years of loss that belonged entirely to me, that nobody could take, that nobody even knew enough to ask about. The Wilmont estate, the one Ashley showed me photos of, glowing with excitement about her lucky booking, became the county's premier wedding venue 3 years after I bought it. I restored the ballroom floor myself, board by board, over a winter when the cold outside matched something cold I was carrying inside. I took a 30% stake in Table and Vine, the catering company that eventually became the estate's exclusive partner, because the owner needed capital during a rough stretch and I happened to have it and happened to believe in what she was building. And 2 years ago, when a regional bank was quietly offloading a batch of commercial loans it considered underperforming, I bought one without much thought beyond the numbers. A construction company, solid fundamentals, temporarily overextended after an aggressive expansion. Callaway Construction and Design. I didn't know Roy Callaway's face. I didn't know he had a daughter. I certainly didn't know that daughter would, 18 months later, fall in love with my son. By the time I found out, by the time Derek came home one Sunday grinning about a girl named Ashley he'd met at a friend's barbecue, the loan was already sitting quietly in Crestline's portfolio, already extended twice through account managers who never mentioned my name to Roy, and Roy never mentioned his troubles to me because as far as he knew, I was just his future son-in-law's plain, quiet father who fixed things for a living. I sat with that irony a long time after the wedding toasts. I did the arithmetic the way I do everything difficult, slowly, on paper, at my kitchen table with the overhead light on and nothing but the hum of the refrigerator for company. The venue discount nobody questioned. The catering costs I'd absorbed without anyone asking why the final invoice came in so much lower than every other estate wedding that year. 2 years of loan leniency extended to a man who had just called me through his son-in-law's mouth. A burden to be tolerated, rather than a father to be honored. I thought about Marion's voice again. Let them have a normal-looking dad. I wondered, sitting there at that table, whether normal-looking had quietly become invisible. Whether I had spent so many years being careful not to be seen that my own son had genuinely never once considered what might be standing behind the plain flannel shirt and the old truck. I closed my laptop that night without finishing the document I'd started in the bathroom at the reception. Not because I'd changed my mind. Because I wanted to be certain, in the cold light of morning, that what I was about to do wasn't rage wearing the costume of principal. I have never once, in 61 years, wanted to be a man who confuses the two. Morning came the way it always does after a night you don't sleep through, gray and a little too honest. I made coffee I didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open to the document I'd started in that bathroom stall, and I read it again from the top, slower this time, the way you'd check a wiring job before you flip the breaker back on. It wasn't a punishment. I want to be clear about that, because I've turned this over in my mind more times than I can count, and I still land in the same place. What I drafted that morning didn't call anything due early. It didn't raise a single interest rate above what the original terms allowed. It simply stopped shielding people who had no idea they were being shielded. 2 years of quiet grace periods on Roy Calloway's loan, extended through an account manager who never once used my name, would end. The account would revert to standard commercial servicing, the same terms any other client of Crestline Holdings operated under, the same terms Roy had signed years before I ever bought the note. And the venue, the catering stake, all of it would move into a trust with tightened language. No informal family carve-outs. No unspoken favors extended because a woman named Ashley happened to be marrying my son. I called Marcus from my truck in the driveway, engine off, the morning cold enough that my breath fogged the windshield. He'd known me 26 years, since before Marion, since before any of this. He picked up on the second ring, already half awake. "You're calling early for a Sunday," he said. "This about the gift papers?" "I'm not signing the gift papers," I said. A pause on his end, the kind that means a man is recalculating. "Harold." "What happened?" I told him. Not with any heat in my voice. I've never been a man who raises his voice. Marion used to say I saved all my volume for silence. But I told him exactly what I'd heard, word for word, the way Derek had said it with a laugh, the way it had landed in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. Marcus was quiet a long moment. "You sure you don't want to sit with this a few more days?" "I sat with it all night," I said. "I'm not doing anything he'll ever be able to point to as cruel. I'm not calling the loan. I'm not raising a single rate. I'm just done being invisible on his behalf." "That's not nothing, Harold." "No," I agreed. "It's not." We went through the language together, line by line, the way we always did when something mattered. By the time we hung up, the sun had come up fully over the Wilmont's distant tree line, and I drove out to the estate. My estate. Though nobody there but the general manager knew that, and sat in the truck in the gravel lot for a while, watching the crew break down the last of the wedding tents, watching them fold white linens that still smelled faintly of last night's candle wax. I thought about going in. I thought about finding Derek, wherever he'd landed after the reception, and telling him everything, laying it all out on a table between us the way you'd lay out a set of blueprints, plain and undeniable. I sat with that thought a long time, my hands on the wheel, the engine ticking as it cooled. I didn't do it. Not out of cowardice, though I've asked myself that question more than once since. I didn't do it because some part of me, the part that had spent 11 years building something quiet and separate and entirely my own, wanted to see what would happen if I simply let the truth arrive on its own schedule, the way truth usually does, without me forcing it into the room. I drove home. I signed the papers that afternoon at my kitchen table, printed and initialed and scanned back to Marcus before the light outside had fully faded, the whole transaction taking less time than it had taken Derek to say 4 words to his new father-in-law the night before. No fanfare. No lawyers in a conference room. Just an old man in a flannel shirt at a table his late wife used to set for 4, now set for 1. Doing the quiet, deliberate work of no longer holding up a bridge nobody knew he'd built. I thought about the wedding cake, still sitting somewhere in a box in someone's refrigerator. 3 tiers of white fondant nobody had gotten around to cutting before I slipped out the side door. I thought about how nobody at that reception had noticed me leave. Not one person had turned around to ask where the groom's father had gone. I fell asleep that night for the first time in 2 days. And if you'd asked me in that moment whether I felt like a man who'd done something terrible, I'd have told you honestly. I felt like a man who had simply stopped disappearing. Weeks have a way of passing quietly when 2 people have spent a lifetime not quite reaching for each other. Derek and I had never been close in the way some fathers and sons are close, the kind who call just to talk, who show up unannounced with a 6-pack and no particular reason. We'd always operated at a polite distance, a handshake at Christmas, a phone call on his birthday that lasted 4 minutes and covered the weather twice. For the first 3 weeks after the wedding, we didn't exchange a word. It didn't feel strange. It felt, if I'm honest, like nothing at all changed. That was the part that unsettled me most, sitting alone at my kitchen table some evenings with the radio on low. Nothing had changed. I had signed papers that quietly reset an entire family's fortunes, and my own son hadn't so much as texted to say thank you for the wedding. Because as far as he knew, there was nothing to thank me for beyond showing up in a rented tuxedo and staying out of everyone's way. I kept myself busy the way I always had. I drove out to the estate twice a week, walked the grounds with the general manager, a good woman named Priscilla, who had no idea the quiet man in the flannel shirt asking about the fountain's pump system was the one signing her paychecks. I fixed a leaning fence post at the duplex property. I went fishing with Marcus on a Saturday and we caught almost nothing and talked about almost everything except what mattered. The way old friends do when one of them needs the silence more than the conversation. Underneath all of it, quietly, the numbers were moving the way numbers do once you stop bending them in someone's favor. I heard about Roy's trouble the way you hear most true things in a small enough town. Sideways. Through someone who wasn't trying to tell you anything at all. Ashley called me in early October, her voice bright and a little too fast, inviting me to a family dinner at her parents' place. "Dad's been so stressed with work," she said, not knowing I was the work she meant. "It'd mean a lot if you came. Might take his mind off things." I went. I sat at Denise and Roy Calloway's dining room table for the first time since the wedding, eating a pot roast that Denise had clearly put real effort into, and I watched Roy push food around his plate without eating much of it. He laughed at the right moments. He asked me polite questions about my truck, about the weather, about nothing that mattered. But there was a tightness behind his eyes I recognized. The particular exhaustion of a man doing math in his head at a table where nobody else can see the numbers. "Business all right?" I asked him once, when Denise had gone to the kitchen for more rolls. Roy's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Rough patch," he said. "Nothing a construction guy hasn't seen before. Loan servicing's just tightened up a bit lately, that's all. Banks being stingier than they used to be." He laughed, short and hollow. "Guess the honeymoon phase with the lender's over." I nodded and passed him the butter and said nothing. And something in my chest sat very still and very heavy for the rest of that dinner. I called Derek that same week, the way I sometimes did when something in me needed to hear his voice, even if the conversation never went anywhere real. He picked up from somewhere loud, a bar, maybe, or a restaurant, silverware clinking somewhere behind him, a woman's laugh rising and falling in the background. "Dad, hey, kind of a bad time. Can I call you back?" "Just checking in," I said. "Wanted to see how you two are settling in." Good. Busy. Roy's company's going through kind of a rough patch. Nothing to worry about. Ashley's a little stressed, but it'll sort itself out. A pause, someone calling his name in the background. Hey, I gotta run. We're about to get a table. The call ended before I could say much else. I sat in my kitchen holding a phone that had already gone quiet, thinking about how easily he'd said nothing to worry about. The exact tone a man uses when he genuinely believes the ground beneath him is solid. It was Marcus who told me the rest 2 weeks later, over coffee at the diner we'd been going to since before either of our hairlines had started retreating. He'd heard it through a contact at the bank Roy had approached. A second loan, smaller, high interest, the kind of business takes out when it's trying to cover a hole with a shovel that's too small for the job. Roy Calloway hadn't come to me. He didn't know there was a me to come to. Instead, quietly, desperately, he had gone looking for money somewhere else, digging a second hole to bury the first. I set my coffee cup down slowly. How deep is he in? Marcus told me the number, and I felt something in my stomach drop the way it does on the first big hill of a roller coaster. That sick, weightless second before you understand exactly how far down you're about to go. The call from Denise Calloway came on a Tuesday evening in late January. 3 months almost to the day since the wedding, while I was standing at my stove stirring a pot of chili I had no real appetite for. I didn't recognize the number at first. When I picked up, her voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Not the polished, image-conscious tone she used at family dinners, but something thinner, cracked at the edges, like ice starting to give. Harold, I'm so sorry to bother you at home. I got your number from Ashley. I wasn't sure who else to call. It's no bother, I said, turning the burner off, though my hand wasn't entirely steady doing it. It's about Roy's business. The loan situation. A breath, ragged. Someone at the bank mentioned the note had been sold a while back, to some holding company, Crestline something. I don't understand any of it, Harold. I thought maybe, since you've done work in real estate, maybe you'd know someone there. Someone we could talk to, explain things to. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and the smell of chili still hanging in the air, and for 3 full seconds I said nothing at all. Because I was the someone she was asking me to find. I'll look into it, I said finally, and the words tasted strange in my mouth, half true and half the heaviest lie I'd told in years. I'll see what I can find out. She thanked me 4 times before we hung up, and I stood at my counter a long while afterward, the chili going cold, my own reflection ghosted faintly in the dark kitchen window. The collapse, once it started, moved faster than I think any of us expected. Calloway Construction missed its January payment entirely. Not late, missed. The kind of missed that trips automatic default language written into loan documents nobody reads until they need to. Standard servicing terms did what standard servicing terms do to a company already stretched thin from 2 years of quiet leniency it never knew it had been receiving and had come, in some unspoken way, to depend on. The equipment lease on Roy's 2 newest excavators lapsed within a week. He laid off half his crew before February, men with families, men who'd worked for him a decade, and I thought of them too, lying awake some nights. Men who had never called anyone a burden, and were losing their paychecks anyway, because of a chain of decisions that started with 4 careless words at a wedding. The house came next. Roy and Denise had put it up as collateral years earlier during the expansion, back when the company looked unstoppable, back before any of us, before even Roy himself, understood how thin unstoppable can actually be. Pre-foreclosure notices don't announce themselves quietly. They arrive on official letterhead, and they get noticed by neighbors, and small towns talk. Ashley showed up at my house on a Thursday afternoon in February, unannounced, her car door slamming hard enough that I heard it from the kitchen before she'd even reached the porch. She was crying before I got the door fully open, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deeper than the immediate crisis, years of something finally breaking loose. They're losing everything, Harold. She said it standing on my welcome mat, not even stepping inside yet. The house, the company. He's not sleeping, he's not eating. Mom's talking to lawyers about bankruptcy, and I don't... She wiped her face with the back of her hand, furious at her own tears. I don't understand how it happened this fast. Everyone kept saying the bank was being reasonable for years, and then suddenly they weren't. And I keep asking Dad why, and he just keeps saying he doesn't know. Some company bought the loan and stopped working with him. I brought her inside. I sat her down at the same kitchen table where I'd signed those papers 3 months earlier. And I made her tea she didn't drink. And I listened to her talk for the better part of an hour about her father's collapsing world. And the entire time some cold and steady part of me sat very still, holding a truth I still wasn't ready to hand her. "Harold," she said finally, looking up at me with red, exhausted eyes. "You're good with this kind of thing. Business, money, all of it. Is there anything you could even look into? Anyone you might know?" I looked at my daughter-in-law, this young woman who had never once, in all the months I'd known her, spoken a careless word about me, who had shown me photos of a venue she thought she'd gotten lucky booking, who had no idea her husband's 4 words at their own wedding had set something in motion that was now dismantling her family piece by piece. "I'll see what I can do," I told her, and I meant it, though not in the way she understood. She left a little after dark. I sat alone at that table long after her taillights had disappeared down the road, the loan file spread open in front of me under the kitchen light, reading through terms I already knew by heart, feeling for the first time the actual, physical weight of what standard business practice does to people once you remove the invisible hand that had been quietly softening it. I had not lied to Roy. I had not raised a rate or moved a deadline early. I had simply stopped protecting people who never knew they'd needed protecting. And watching what that truth had done to a family sitting 3 months from ruin, I understood, finally and completely, that being right and feeling right were 2 very different rooms, and I was standing alone in the second one. Derek found the name on a Sunday afternoon, sitting at his in-laws' kitchen table with a stack of loan paperwork Roy had finally, reluctantly, laid out in front of him. The kind of documents a proud man only shares once pride has stopped being useful. Crestline Holdings. He told me later the name snagged on something in the back of his mind before he could even say why, a splinter he couldn't quite place until he was halfway through his second read of the loan servicing letter. Then he remembered. A manila folder, years old, tucked in the glove compartment of my old truck the summer he'd borrowed it to move a couch across town. He'd flipped through it out of idle boredom at a red light, seen the name printed across the top of a property tax statement, thought nothing of it, assumed it was some client I did handyman work for, and never mentioned it again in 8 years. He showed up at my shop that evening without calling first, the bell over the door announcing him before I'd even turned around. I could tell from the way he was standing, shoulders squared, jaw tight, a folder rolled up in one fist like he needed something to hold on to, that whatever calm distance had always existed between us was about to end, one way or another, right there among my wire spools and the smell of solder. "Tell me I'm wrong," he said. No hello, no preamble. He unrolled the folder and slapped it flat on my workbench. "Tell me Crestline Holdings isn't yours." I looked down at the papers, then back up at my son's face, and I didn't reach for a single evasive word. "It's mine," I said. He went pale, then red in the span of about 4 seconds. "You own the loan. You've owned it this whole time. You own the venue we got married at. Ashley's been telling me for months how lucky we were with that booking, and it was... What, you just handed it to us? And then what, you just decided to pull the rug out from under her father because of one comment at a wedding?" "I didn't call anything early," I said, and I kept my voice level, the way I have my whole life, because raising it has never once made a true thing truer. "I didn't raise a single rate above what your father-in-law originally signed for. I didn't punish anyone, Derek. I stopped being invisible." "That's not an answer, that's a technicality." His voice cracked on the last word, and I watched something in him, some certainty about who his father was, start to come apart in real time. You're telling me you own everything, the venue, the caterer, the loan, and you just sat there at my wedding, smiling, like none of it was yours. I was raising a glass to you, I said. And you were telling Roy Calloway I was a burden you only invited because you had to. The shop went very quiet. Somewhere behind me, the compressor kicked on, that low mechanical hum filling the space where neither of us was speaking. And I let it run the way I always do, counting the seconds without meaning to. 80-some seconds of silence stretched between us like something physical. You heard that, he said finally, quieter now. Every word. He sat down hard on the stool by the workbench, the folder still open in front of him, and put his face in his hands for a moment. When he looked back up, there wasn't anger in his eyes anymore, just something rawer and harder to name. Dad, I didn't mean it like... You meant it exactly like you said it, I told him, and I didn't say it cruelly, just true, the way I've tried to say everything since that night. You've never once asked me a real question about my life. Not what I do with my days, not why I drive the same truck for 15 years when I clearly don't need to. Not why the venue costs came in so low that nobody at your wedding questioned it. You never asked because you never imagined there was anything to ask about. I was just your dad. Quiet, simple, easy to overlook. I set my hand flat on the workbench between us, the way I do when I need something steady to hold on to, too. I wasn't a burden at your wedding, Derek. I was the reason you had one. He didn't argue with that. He sat there a long time, the folder open between us, the compressor finally cutting off and leaving the shop in a silence that felt different than the one before it. Less like tension and more like the quiet that comes right after something breaks, when you're still not sure yet what's left standing underneath. Why didn't you ever tell us? He asked finally, and his voice had lost every bit of the sharpness it walked in with. Any of it. Why did you let us think? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We both understood exactly what he meant. And for the first time since I'd raised that glass and smiled at my son across a room I owned, I found myself with an answer I actually wanted to give him. Because I didn't want to be loved for what I owned, I said. I wanted to be loved for who I was. And I figured if I never told you what I had, I'd actually find out. Derek sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath. And now you know, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Now I know. I agreed. I didn't dress it up for him. Didn't soften the answer into something easier to carry. I told him plainly that for 11 years I had built something separate from our family on purpose, brick by brick and property by property, because grief had taught me that the only thing nobody can take from you is the thing you never let them see. I told him about his mother, about the promise I'd made her in a hospital room to let him and his sister have a normal-looking father, and how somewhere along the way, normal-looking had quietly turned into invisible, and I hadn't noticed the difference until a wedding toast made it impossible to ignore any longer. He didn't defend himself. That surprised me more than anything else that night. He just sat there on the stool in my shop, turning the folder over in his hands and said, I have to go see Roy. I know, I said. It took another week before I was ready to sit across from Roy Calloway myself, man to man, without Denise's tearful phone call or Ashley's raw grief standing between us. Marcus came with me, more for the paperwork than the conversation, and we sat at Roy's own kitchen table, the same one where I'd eaten his wife's pot roast and watched him push food around his plate without eating it. And I told him everything, who I was, what I owned, what I'd done, and just as plainly, why. Roy didn't yell either. He'd lost too much by then to have much yelling left in him. He just looked at me for a long time, a proud man staring at the shape of his own undoing, and finally said, You could have told me 2 years ago. Saved us both a lot. I could have, I admitted. I didn't know I needed to yet. What came after wasn't forgiveness dressed up as generosity, and I want to be honest about that, because I think the difference matters. I didn't erase Roy's debt. I didn't pretend the last 3 months hadn't happened. Marcus and I sat down with Roy, and for the first time, with the actual terms fully visible on the table between us, and we restructured what remained into something he could genuinely carry. Fair terms, transparent terms, the kind two honest men negotiate when neither one is hiding behind an account manager anymore. It cost me something to do it that way instead of simply wiping the slate clean. I think that's exactly why it mattered. Therick and I didn't fix 8 years of quiet distance in a single conversation either. Some things don't work that way, and I've stopped expecting them to. But something shifted between us that didn't shift back. He started calling on Sundays, not because he needed anything, just to talk, the way I'd always wished he would. He asked me questions now, real ones, about Crestline, about his mother, about the years I'd spent building something alone in a house that had gone quiet after she left it. I answered every one of them. I'd waited a long time for someone to ask. Father's Day came around that June. Ashley invited me to a small dinner at their new place, nothing fancy, just family, Roy and Denise included, the first time all of us had sat at one table since everything came apart. I almost didn't go. Some old habit in me still expected to arrive and find myself forgotten at the edges of the room the way I had for years without ever quite noticing. There was a place card waiting at my seat when I walked in. Simple, handwritten, nothing fancy about the paper or the ink. Just my name, spelled right, sitting exactly where someone had decided I belonged before I ever set foot through the door. No mention of Crestline, no mention of the venue or the loan or any of the quiet architecture I'd spent 11 years building in the dark. Just Dad, written in Derek's handwriting, at a table where somebody had finally counted me in before I had to remind them I existed. I sat down in that chair, and for the first time since Marion passed, I felt like a man who had stopped disappearing on purpose and started, slowly, letting himself be found. If you've ever quietly carried more for the people you love than they'll ever know about, if you've ever wondered what would happen if they found out everything you never once asked credit for, I'd love to hear your answer to this. Would you have let it all collapse without a word of explanation, the way I almost did? Or do you think I was right, in the end, to soften the landing once my son finally saw me? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, including the ones that tell me I got it wrong. And if this story found you somewhere real tonight, there are more waiting for you below. Stories about the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who turned out to be carrying more than anybody ever thought to ask.